Good day. I'm going to report about genre studies. Now let's define what is genre studies. Genre studies is an academic subject which studies genre theory as branch of general critical theory in several different fields, including art, literature, linguistics, and rhetoric. Literary genre studies is a structuralist approach to the study of genre and genre theory in literary theory, film theory, and other cultural theories. The study of genre in this way examines the structural elements that combine in the telling of a story and finds patterns in collections of stories. When these elements or semiotic codes begin to carry inherent information, a genre emerges. Linguistic genre studies can be roughly divided into two schools. These are the systematic functional linguistics and English for specific purposes. ESFL scholars believe that language structure is an integral part of text social context and function, while ESP examines the pedagogical applications of genre, focusing in particular on genre analysis as means to help non-native English speakers to use the language and its conventions. ESF scholars often conduct research that focuses on genre's usefulness in pedagogy, while ESP genre analysis involves identifying discourse elements such as register, formation of conceptual and genre structures, modes of thought and action that exist in a specific discourse community. Now, let's go on to the history of genre theory. Genre theory or genre studies got underway with the ancient Greeks, who felt that particular types of people would produce only certain types of poetry. The Greeks also believed that certain metrical forms were suited only to certain genres, as what Aristotle said, we have then a natural instinct for representation and for true rhythm, and starting with these instincts, men will gradually develop them until they produce poetry out of their improvisations. Poetry then split into two kinds according to the poet's nature, where the more serious poets represented the noble deeds of noblemen, while those of a less exalted nature represented the actions of inferior men. At first, writing satire such as the author, others wrote hymns and eulogies. This is all based on Plato's mimetic principle. Exalted people will, in imitation of exaltation, write about exalted people doing exalted things, and vice versa with the lower types. Genre is not a black and white issue even for Aristotle, who recognized that though the Iliad is an epic, it can be considered a tragedy as well, both because of its tone as well as the nobility of its characters. However, most of the Greek critics were less acutely aware of the inconsistencies in this system. For these critics, there was no room for ambiguity in their literary taxonomy because these categories were thought to have innate qualities that could not be disregarded. The Romans carried on the Greek tradition of literary criticism. The Roman critics were quite happy to continue on in the assumption that there were essential differences between the types of poetry and drama. There is much evidence in their works that Roman writers themselves saw through these ideas and understood genres and how they function on a more advanced level. However, it was the critics who left their mark on Roman literary criticism, and they were not innovators. After the fall of Rome, when the scholastic system took over literary criticism, genre theory was still based on the essential nature of genres. This is most likely because of Christianity's affinity for Platonic concepts. This state of affairs persisted until the 18th century. At the end of the 18th century, the theory of genre based on classical thought began to reveal beneath the intellectual chafing of the Enlightenment. The introduction of the printing press brought text to the larger audience. Then pamphlets and broadsides began to diffuse information even farther, and a greater number of less privileged members of society began to iterate and began to express their views. Suddenly, authors authors of both high and low culture were now competing for the same audience. This worked to destabilize the classical notions of genre, while still drawing attention to genre because new genres like the novel were being generated. Ever since the late 18th century, literary critics have been trying to find a theory of genre that would be more commensurate with the realities of individual texts within genres. The evolution of genre took many twists and turns through the 18th and 20th century. Genre in the late 18th century, genre concepts in theory and in practice arise, change, and decline for historical reasons. And since each genre is composed of texts that accrue, the grouping is a process, not a definite category. Genre are open categories. Each member alters the genre by adding, contradicting, or changing constituents, especially those of members most closely related to it. What is genre criticism? Well, genre criticism has thus become one of the main methodologies within rhetorical criticism. Genre criticism is a method within rhetorical criticism analyzes texts in terms of their genre. The set of generic expectations, conventions, and constraints that guide their production and interpretation. In rhetoric, the theory of genre provides a means to classify and compare artifacts in terms of their formal, substantive, and contextual features. By grouping active artifacts with others which have similar formal features to rhetorical existence. Rhetorical critics can shed light on how authors use or float conventions for their own purposes. Literary critics have used the concepts of genres to classify speeches and works of literature since the time of Aristotle, who distinguished three rhetorical genres: the legal or judicial, the deliberative or political, and the ceremonial or epidictic. Further contemporary genre criticism has revised understanding of genre in several ways. The first term is represented by Mikhail Mikhailovich Bakhtin, who focuses on the formal features of communication. The second is represented by Caroline Miller, who focuses on recurring socio-cultural circumstances. And the last term is our critics have begun applying formalist and social-cultural concepts to new media artifacts that tend to resist classifications into traditional genre categories. Now, here are the examples of genre studies. These are novels, poetry, short stories, novella, and so on. Now, that's my report. Thank you. Good day and happy holiday.